Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to our latest webinar entitled Why Do Some Scientific Papers Get Rejected? My name is Wendy Knox and I'm a business manager for Emerald Publishing in Southern Eastern Europe. Today I'm joined by my colleague Jo Jones, who is a senior publisher at Emerald Publishing, who will give a brief presentation on the subject. And then our guest speaker, Professor Sankar Sivarajah, who is head of the School of Management from the University of Bradford in the UK. Who will share his experience as an editor of one of Emerald's journals, the Journal of Enterprise Information Management. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. The presentation will be recorded and the audience is muted. You will receive an email afterwards with the recording should you wish to re-listen to any parts. If you have any questions during the session, please just write them in the chat box to the top right of your screen and we will hopefully answer all questions. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the session, and if there's not enough time, although I'm sure there will be, we will email you with an answer, and the session should last approximately an hour. So we'll get started, and I'll pass over to Jo Jones, Senior Publisher at Emerald Publishing.
Hi. Welcome to the webinar. We're looking forward to spending some time with our author community today, and first of all, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to do an introduction and just do a brief introduction about who Emerald are and what we do, in case any of you are brand new to us. And then I'm going to pass over to Sankar, who will talk about the role of the journal in academia and talk about why papers are rejected and hopefully help you get yours published. And at the end, as Wendy mentioned, we'll have a question and answer session. Okay, moving on. So Emerald was founded in 1967 in Bradford, West Yorkshire, by academics for academics, and now we're a global publishing and content company. Our core subjects are business management, education, engineering, and information science, and we publish over 300 journals, which actually means there's over 30 million Emerald articles downloaded over the course of a year. We also have a front list of over 300 books, and we're expanding in teaching cases with 3 different case products containing almost 2,000 teaching cases, which tend to be in the business and management fields. We are known for supporting early career researchers, and as we're doing today, offering support to all authors throughout each stage of the publication process and helping you get those papers to publication. Okay, moving on. So real impact is about making a difference, and this is something that we are really passionate about. We're passionate about mission-driven research. The Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action to end poverty, to protect the planet, and ensure equality. We're passionate about the impact that your research can have and will have. And when we talk about impact, we're talking about making that real difference. So impact is the provable effects of research in the real world. So what that means, it's the changes that we can see and demonstrate and measure and capture beyond academia. So we've got citations, but that's one metric and in one community. And we're looking to understand what impact your research can have in society, to the economy, in the environment, and where that happens. So how your research has contributed to that, or where a change has been caused by it. So we're really committed also to the development of a full open programme, and we want to offer our authors a full range of open access publication routes and services. And this is to help you as authors make the right publication choice, and for us to be able to provide unrivaled support and resources throughout the publishing process. So I hope this session will be really useful to you all. I look forward to questions at the end, and with that I'll hand over to Sankar. Thank you, Sankar.
Thank you, Jo, and Hope everyone's keeping safe and well, given the times that we are living in. And I think that's more important at this moment in time. Before I just go into sort of highlighting the importance of the journals, the actual role of the journal itself, and why do these scientific papers that contribute to so much work do get unfortunately rejected. So that's the theme, and I think that's what I'm going to cover in the next 25 minutes. But as also an editor of a journal, but also an author of publishing journals, I've seen both sides of the sort of story, and I just want to share sort of my experience, some tips, some sort of things that has worked really well, and how do you actually sort of get published in good journals in your relevant field. So that's what I want to kind of focus on the next 30 minutes. So these are not very prescriptive. They are sort of experiences that I hold and I would like to share with yourselves so that you can become published as well. But more importantly, I think I'll just very quickly touch upon what the purpose of the journal and why do you actually want to sort of publish in a journal as opposed to sort of books or other mediums. I think that's important. I'm not going to give you a history lesson here, but I think what is the important role that journals have to play, and I think publishers like Emerald have a significant role to make sure that reaches the right audience and the target sort of market that they reach out to this important work. So of course it's a very important piece of avenue for us to sort of make as authors who have able to produce sort of scientific work based on primary research and empirical work. It's a medium where we can actually claim our work and authors' recognition where they have actually made a scientific discovery and that they're proud of something that they want to publish and disseminate to the right audience as we speak. So it does also help as a peer-reviewed, certified sort of work where there's rigor and quality. So the journal does act as a very piece of work that comes with the rigor and helps reach to that market or the target audience in terms of dissemination. And actually it holds as a public record. So it's there as an archive where people can go back and cite your work. Practitioners, be it practitioners or fellow researchers, have a medium of record where they can actually look at citing your work. So that act in itself actually plays an important role where your scientific work that can be actually published in a piece of journal. And more so now, it's, I guess, as technology sort of helps, I think it also acts as a navigation and a signpost of the work that is being done within sort of the scientific area, opposed to sort of a manual record. I think there's quite an important piece helping people to navigate within that. So that is the importance of the journal. I think it's important to understand what makes how your work could be published in a journal and the differences opposed to other mediums of, let's say, publishing in terms of magazine. All of them have a different role to play, but I guess the journal has an important role in terms of having your scientific quality work that is peer reviewed by people. That is important sort of to look at. Now, how do you get started? I think that's important. I think how do you actually come to the point where you can think about contributing sort of into a publishable paper? So some questions for you all to think about. If you have some work that is ongoing or scientific work that you're carrying out, have you completed the project successfully? Is there some findings that you really want to share with sort of relevant audience? That might be a piece that you want to think about producing into a journal paper. Of course, choosing the right target journal to think about where it might be actually attractive. Are you wrestling with a problem or which has no clear solution and you want to explore this case? Or do you have an opinion or observation of a subject which might be a viewpoint paper? Or are you thinking about a developmental piece of paper or research that you can actually choose to publish as well in terms of conference papers? Or if you're looking at your PhDs or doctoral master's thesis that has come to sort of a fruitful position where you can actually think, actually, this actually needs more of a circulation and understanding of where you might get feedback and being able to publish it. Or you have a groundbreaking idea and you have empirically looked at it from a research point where you think that needs to be shared and actually claim your certified sort of way of saying, actually, this is your piece of scientific discovery that you want to share to the world and have a real impact. So these are some of the questions, I would say, fundamental questions to think about if you are going to create sort of a publishable paper that you want to try and, of course, choose the right target journal. So what do editors and reviewers look for? So you've got that sort of a starting point to think about whether actually your journal or your paper or your work you are currently doing, a primary research that you have, or a viewpoint that you might work. So how do you actually then get to the point where you are looking at a target journal, be it the Journal of Enterprise Information Management or be it Journal of Consumer Research, depending on the piece of work that you're doing within the management field, for example, I'll take that. You will probably need to think very fundamentally if you want to get through the editor's sort of board and the reviewers who look at the rigor and the quality of your piece of work. You need to really think about these 10 key points. And I think some might be familiar with yourselves, depending on the sort of areas that you publish in or you're being published in. It's important to understand what the contribution is, the originality of the work, both theoretical, practical, or the methodological contribution that you can contribute to the existing knowledge that you want to sort of probably from your work that you do. What is the relevance of that work, and how does that relate to the body of knowledge that already exists? Are you actually improving or incrementing some sort of existing knowledge where you are actually contributing to theory or practice? That's important. The methodological rigor. Are your conclusions valid? Because I think the methodology has a huge role to play, because you could do a really fantastic piece of work, but if your methodology is not rigorous, then the actual results are questionable. So I think another very important point is to think about the methodology, the relevance, originality. Those three are very, very fundamental even before you move into sort of the composition. And as soon as we look at from, I guess, an editor's point or the reviewer's point of view, when you submit a paper to sort of look at it, those are key things they will very much look at before they even thinking about actually passing on to experts who might be associate editors within the group or reviewers to look at it further. Now, moving on from that stage, you need to think, how do you actually communicate this whole piece of work? You might have a wonderful piece of work that you have done, but if you can't clarify it and structure it in a way that reads well, and someone else can pick up and cite your work and understand what you're trying to communicate, I think that's important. So that's where the structure comes in, the arguments, the logical constructions, the story, the narrative has a fundamental part to play, where that actually you can lead the reader to understand what sort of piece of research that you have done in a very coherent and a logical and a structure. And that again is quite a fundamental piece of element that goes into looking at probably structuring how your paper looks at. So even the arguments that make up this story is very much important. Now, implication, as I say in the sixth one, is very much relevant to the relevance and the contribution I was talking about. Is it actually improving or actually contributing back to the theory, or be it theory of consumer behavior or theory of any other existing well-established theory? What is your research doing to actually testing that theory or extending that theory from your piece of work that you have done? I think that is what the beauty of science is, to make sure that you have a critical eye or a debate that you can form to actually challenge some of the theories and actually to increment knowledge over there. And I think that has a real implication and the impact that we were talking about, and to the impact that leads to the practitioner. So the fundamental question there is, so what? So you've done a piece of work. The question that you need to really think about is, so what? How does this have an impact to the society? How does this have an impact to the economy? How does this have an impact to, let's say, the environment? I think all that is an important piece of work. And if there's no sort of impact, then the research really doesn't really get the traction, and there's really not doing much value towards what the sort of societal impact that it needs to. So equally important, I guess, that really comes back with references, the global sort of focus that you reach out to the audience, and the scope, and where that actual target journal might be fit for it. And those are key things that you really, really need to think about when you're looking at sort of how your paper could fundamentally be structured. And finally, last but not least, think about the title, the attractiveness and the reach, and that you want to communicate, and the keywords that you use, and the abstract. All that makes a huge point in terms of putting together a good piece of work into a journal paper. So just to summarize, those are key 10. Of course, there are different other angles to look at, but those are what editors and reviewers are generally looking for when they look at a paper that is. So make sure that you have this, even before I give you the reasons why the scientific papers are rejected. Okay. Like I said before, moving on, I think journal, the beauty of journal is that these are peer-reviewed piece of work where you actually have something to contribute, but then it does go independently through a peer review process, which actually adds rigor to the piece of research that you are. And these peer reviews are done by experts in the field or the knowledge. And I think there is the role of the peer reviews, and different journals might use different approaches, but you need to understand how the peer review and the role of the peer review does work before even thinking about why do papers do get rejected. So some journals might choose a single blind review where the reviewer names are hidden from the authors, but the name of the authors made known to the reviewers. All of them have their pros and cons, or the advantages and disadvantages, but it really does depend on how each of the journals where they are you are looking to publish are using an approach. So it's fundamentally important that you understand. Very common practice is double-blind review, where authors and the review identities are not disclosed at all, reduces any bias. I think that is quite a very common approach within journal of or within the management field where we are trying to publish. Or even further, you can have the triple-blind review where identities of authors, reviewers, and editors are not known at all. So that is another approach that has been adopted by different journals at this moment in time. And the new kid on the block, as we call it, with open access publishing as well growing as a prominent, is where it's an open review where both author and reviewers are known, and they probably build a relationship where they actually think about the expertise, and that sort of a critical sort of friendly approach into improving the role of sort of the research that you produce is there. So I think the whole peer review process is not there. I think if it's fundamentally approached very correctly, the process of the peer reviews to help improve your work, and that is important that you as authors understand. And it's not there to sort of make sure that your work doesn't get published. I think the peer review, the role of peer review is there to make sure the work that you have produced is there to sort of be more improved, and when it does get published, it's a good quality piece of work. So just to very quickly summarize all that, I think it's the importance of the role of journal. What do editors and reviewers really look at? Those 10 fundamental things, and why is it important to have the peer review to make sure that rigor is there? Now, at this stage, if you sort of if you feel that there is still that you get that rejection notices that we all are not, of course, really looking forward to having that, but that's part and parcel of academia. Doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. But why do papers still get rejected? I think I'm going to focus on the next sort of 15 minutes on these key tips and tricks as editor, where I find, I think, things that fundamentally go wrong and things that you can actually avoid to get to that stage of getting a rejection. I still get a rejection notice. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world, but it's important to reflect on what has probably needs to be improved upon your work, where it still does sort of lead to that impact of having your paper published in the right target journal. So one of the first key things I think it's important as authors you all have to think about is the purpose of that work that you produce, that empirical research that you feel very passionate about. What is the purpose of this? And if the purpose is not clear, when you sort of outline it in your abstract, the aim of that purpose, of the key reasons why they are sort of looked at and why are you doing this piece of research, needs to be really, really aligned towards also solving a real problem. Yeah, I think you shouldn't be sometimes blinded by having a passion for doing something, which is important, but it doesn't solve a real problem or a need, which creates that societal impact that we are looking for wider reach. So I think it's important to have that together, the marriage together, to have the practical need, your passion, of course, because given the expertise that you come with, that needs to be really fundamentally clear. And the golden thread, as I would say, is to be very, very clear on the aim statement. What is the aim of this paper? What is the research question, the problem that you're trying to solve? And that has to be really, really clear, and it can be appearing in your abstract of the paper, it can come in your introduction, but don't have confusing aims and the purpose. You might not want to say, you might say it very differently from the abstract to the introduction to the conclusions, but you need to make sure they are succinct, they're clear, purposeful statement that you really write. And that's a very practical thing. So don't have it long-winded. Don't think about reflecting on what this clear aim is. And fundamentally, most authors and the papers that come through sometimes really have confusing messages. You might have one aim statement that you might put in the abstract, but completely something different. Suddenly, when you go into introduction, you have a completely different aim, and that confuses the reader. So make sure you have a very important and a clear purpose and an aim statement that is there in the journal, and that will do a lot to make sure that you communicate the message through that. Second thing, which I always see, and I was kind of highlighting this previously, is the originality of the purpose of the work that you're doing. And I love the image on the right-hand side. I need to emphasize the fact that just because you're original also doesn't mean that you are unique in its own way. Yeah. So you need to make sure the purpose is there still. You're trying to tackle a real research problem or research question, and you're not doing something that you think, okay, I think this hasn't been done in the previous, but you need to question. So what is the impact of this work? So being original does mean that you have added value towards it. Is it actually solving a sort of consumer behavior issue problem which hasn't been looked previously? Or you might be very careful in looking at what the literature review looks at, but it's important to really understand the originality of the work, and that has to be clearly defined, but also making sure that shows a real impact and a value that helps sort of think about what your research is trying to solve. And that is important, and that is highly something that the editors and the reviewers really look at. What originality or the findings that you have done is actually helping sort of contribute to, I don't know, the research of consumer behavior. What has that been not done previously, and where you might be looking at incremental sort of knowledge that you want to impart within the field of, let's say, consumer research. And that's important. And that comes in hand with the findings. There's no point if you do find that you're repeating. Yes, it's important to empirically validate the findings that you sort of get from your research, but those findings do need to sort of highlight and probably shed some light where there is actually something not known previously. And that's important. It doesn't need to be groundbreaking. Sometimes it really depends on the journal that you, but even if there's an incremental sort of knowledge that you want to impart, it needs to be something that hasn't been looked at previously or in the existing literature, where you are trying to sort of give something an interesting finding. It doesn't mean, again, that you need to say something positive all the time, because I think sometimes the quantitative research also thinks, okay, if there's no significant correlation between a hypothesis, you report the findings as it is, because that would in itself be an interesting finding. So I think that's important to know the gaps and the problem, the questions that you are trying to tackle, and the research that you are trying to do to solve that is able to answer using sort of the findings that are coming with it. And that really helps increase the impact and the contribution that you want to sort of impart, and how you are able to do that using sort of the real findings that you want to come up with. And I think the key word there is the novel findings, or something that you really want to contribute. And that's a fundamental piece of work. And you will see as part of, I guess, if you see the rejection sort of letters that you get, which are, well, every single person gets in academia most of the time, is those are three fundamental things: the purpose, the originality, and the findings. They would probably say, actually, your work doesn't really say something new that really looks at the work that you have been doing, so therefore has sadly, let's say, has been rejected. So these are key fundamental things really you need to be focusing on to make sure that you are producing a piece of work that is being able to be published. Okay, hope that's clear so far. Then we go, so those are fundamental pieces that I think would lead to sort of a piece of work that's not being published. But equally important, I think, you've done a wonderful piece of work. I go back to this and I can't emphasize a lot, because the first impression that you give someone, I think with the piece of the work that you produce, is how you communicate the work. And that comes fundamentally to the structure of the paper that you have, and the title, the keywords, and how you are looking at focusing on producing that work, the wonderful piece of work that you might have done. But if you can't probably communicate it in the right manner, the work that you have done is probably wasted. So therefore, you need to really look at structuring your paper, the title, having a clear title, which is probably attractive, catches the reader's eye, having the right keywords, especially with the digital sort of media at the moment. The keywords, the search engine optimization really helps reach the target audience that you want to. So make sure you have no more than 3 to 5 keywords, a good short title that helps you sort of work in your favor to make sure it's actually publishable. So working with that sort of means that you also continue to polish your work. And what I always say to that, and I do this now, once you have done your sort of, let's say you're drafting your paper, make sure that you set aside at least 2 weeks worth of time to reflect on the piece of work that you have done, looking at incorrect grammar, spelling, make sure you have a proofreader, or use your sort of peer colleagues to critically review your work, making sure it's not inaccurate references. These are simple things that we find as editors and reviewers that actually you might have done a wonderful piece of work, but you come to that, if you make these simple mistakes, really gives a bad impression. So I can't emphasize a lot. I think you do definitely need to probably, if you've drafted a piece of work or paper, it might be that your native language is not English. You need to make sure that you leave it aside for a bit of time. Make sure you get some help in terms of any critical friends. Make sure you go back to that piece of work after 2 weeks and go through the work that you have written and make sure that actually it is what you want to communicate, and there's no sort of sloppy mistakes that will then show a bad impression on the editors or reviewers. And this is a classic example. Like I said, this is where someone actually leaves away a piece of work, the research, and then comes back to it after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and you will see the number of mistakes that you find. You might feel that, okay, you might want to print it out and see the questions and have that sort of time to actually do a self-peer review on your piece of work before you submit it to the editors or the publishing journal, because I think that goes a long way in polishing your last piece of work, because you've done quite a bit of time. You spend probably 1 year, 2 years, depending on the research that you do. You really don't want the communication, the structure, the clarity on sort of driven by the paper that you produce be overshadowed by some silly mistakes that you make. And that's often done. I do that every single time. I make some mistakes where most of the things have looked at really well, but the more and more you spend time on it, you might overlook some of the things that you really sort of look at. So it's important that you have the critical, fresh pair of eyes to look at the work that you produce. So that really improves the quality of work that before it gets to the editor's desk. So that's, again, I can't emphasize enough to sort of make sure that you are looking at improving your piece of work by having a self-peer review as a process as well. And that is important. I think there are simple things as bad writing, as we say, poor opinions, and you don't want to irritate the reviewer by having sort of typo mistakes or even quoting the incorrect sort of, let's say, language that you use, or the academic writing style changes to a very colloquial writing style. All that probably gives the wrong impression, which you don't really want to upset the editors or reviewers after all your hard work. So please do take some time to look at it. And still, if you get to that stage where you've done every single thing, like I've said, from the originality, the purpose, thinking about the new findings, making sure you've got the right titles, the keywords, the structure, and if you still feel that you're getting that rejection notices, which are sadly sort of not something that you look forward to, it might be because it's not the journal that really is looking at sort of the fit. For example, you might be looking at, I don't know, marketing theory that you want to be publishing, but you might be targeting a journal of, I guess, business sustainability, for example. They might not see the relevant fit. So the editorial scope is absolutely important. And it might be a tip there would be, even if you have an abstract, you might want to send it to the editor-in-chief and say, actually, is this a journal a right fit to this the work that you have produced? And they might come back without sort of spending too much time on it through the normal process of review. They will come back and say, actually, you might want to think about a different journal. So that saves a lot of time for you as well. So I think that's an important area to think about if you are still receiving sort of those rejection notice. So to reflect back on why, or does it really, the work that you produce, is it really sort of that fit for the journal? Some journals probably prefer more qualitative piece of work, some prefer quantitative piece of work, some prefer practitioners sort of point of views. So really important to understand what the editorial scope of the journal is, the topic, the reach of audience, all that matters. And if that still doesn't fit, it might be because the contribution that you're trying to make or the methodology that you're using, like I said, is really not appropriate for the journal sort of target journal that you are trying to reach. So look at those, and if that might be the case, then you really need to think about how you reshape your research and try and new journal. It's not the end of the world. I keep on saying, if you do, and rejection is part of the academia world, it's not the end of the world. There's always avenues for your work to be published. But I think it's important to make sure you have a quality piece of work from the start to the beginning, looking at those things that I've kind of highlighted and mentioned, really to get to that stage where you can become a highly publishable sort of work that you produce, so that you become a published author. So those are the tips and tricks, I would say. And I think you really need to look at this sort of the link I would share with you. It's 100 research. It's not 100 research rules to the games, how to successfully publish. I'm not going to go through all that 100 tips and tricks, but I think I will look at some of the things that you really need to think about if you are trying to target those top international referee journals. Look at a plan. You need a plan just for like any sort of work that you're trying to do. Even when you're trying to do a research, think about how you're going to be collecting the data, who might you looking at in terms of access to sort of methodological expertise. Think about creating the publication strategy plan, where your literature is going to come from. That is absolutely important. The time that you want to spend on it, the deadlines that you create, that is fundamentally important if you want to think about publishing in a really, really top international referee journal. Find a critical friend. I've said this before, I'm saying this now again. There's only so much you kind of see it from your own perspective. You might be stuck in your bubble. So it's always nice to have a colleague or a critical friend that can look at your work and give a different, fresh perspective into looking at improving your work. Make sure it's a good critical friend who really is honest and doesn't just say, actually, this work is really good. But that doesn't really help you if there's really significant genuine work to be improved. So do before you even try and think of submitting to the editors the journal, think about finding a critical friend that will really help you improve your piece of work. Yeah, so I think that's important. Pass the replication and the transparency test. Yeah, describe your method. If you can, make sure that, like I said, the rigor of the methodology that you choose. How did you access your interviews? How did you go about collecting the survey data? Think about the actual process that you have gone through, and can this be replicated by someone else who wants to do a future research on your work? And that needs to be really, really fundamental, and that process needs to be transparently recorded, and that adds value. And this is the difference between an empirical piece of work that you're trying to publish in a scientific work, that in a journal, and that is absolutely important that you think about doing that. Surprise from your research, know how to write it. You need to really have the communication, the clear structure, and how you explain the results that really catches sort of the audience that you really want to target. Don't take anything for granted. Make sure that you write it in a way that every single person who might not even be a subject expertise in your area, but will be able to really understand what your work is trying to do, because end of the day, the peer reviews, although there will be subject expertise, they might come from different fields, expertise, methodological expertise. You need to really make sure that you are really explaining it in a way that it would be convincing and understood by any single person who reads your work. So don't take acronyms for granted. For example, someone else might not know what an some sort of acronym that you use. For example, yes, CSR might mean something else for someone. It might mean corporate social responsibility for yourself, but it doesn't mean that every single person. So make sure you spell out those. So write very clearly. Like I said, it might be the case that you are not a native English writer. That's where you have critical friends, or you read a professional proofreader services, where you really are able to express what you're trying to do in terms of research to that sort of angle that you're looking at. And look back at the journal articles and where you're trying to publish, and hook into the journal's backyard. Because what the editors really want to see is, how is your work, if you're trying to target, for example, the Journal of Enterprise Information Management, how does that work that you produce and you're trying to publish in there relate to the existing work that's already been published in there? So you really need to go back and be smart about looking at what work that has been published related to your piece of work. For example, if you're looking at consumer behavior, and looking at what's been published in the already journal that you're targeting, and actually, is there something that you can really relate and link back to it, and have those explicit sort of hooks, I would say, hook it into their sort of journal backyard, and that impresses the editors and the reviewers to say, actually, this is also a real target sort of journal. And the simple trick I always say is, when you've done your sort of writing up your paper, you might go back to your reference list, and you will see, if you are mostly cited in Journal of Business Research, for example, then you think, actually, that piece of work is really targeted at Journal of Business Research and not something else. It'll also probably help you, the editorial scope, to be rightly aligned for you. So that's another tip I would say that really does work. Finally, last but not least, really do enjoy your research, because if you are not passionate about what you're trying to do and there's no real purpose for it, after probably 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you will probably lose interest in it and you won't persevere to sort of get it published. I never lose hope. I get rejections every single time, like I said, and I never lose hope. I make sure that, of course, if it needs improvement, self-reflect on the work sort of things. Don't take it personally. The feedback that is given to you is not personal. It's on the piece of work that you produce. It's not at you, targeted at you. So it's important that you really reflect on the work, and it is there to help you improve your piece of work and enjoy your piece of work, where you can really persevere to make sure that your work is published and it does really get the attention it really deserves. So the impact that really it creates, the societal impact that it really deserves, is important. So I think most importantly, just like any piece of work that you do definitely enjoy your research, or otherwise you won't be here in academia. I think that's important, that you have that opportunity, you have that powerful opportunity to sort of actually contribute to the body of knowledge, and the scientific discoveries that you make has a real impact to the community, the society, and that is what drives your sort of research. And the editors really want to see that come through the writing style that you have, the work that you have, whether it's timely, relevant, and I think that needs to really be showcased in your piece of work, whatever field that you try and publish, be it in business management, be it in science, medicine. I think those are very, very fundamental, important tips and tricks. Some publication etiquettes, I think, as editor, I will always say this, some do's and don'ts, and I'm coming close to my end of my sort of pitch to yourselves. Do not make sure that you don't submit it to more than one journal. These are very simple sort of hygiene rules. If you've already submitted it somewhere else, wait for that whole process to be done. Don't submit it somewhere else until that paper has been sort of withdrawn or published. So don't do a multiple sort of array of blanket sort of publishing strategy, and that is not appreciated. It is a very small world. Editors do speak, and you will be probably banned from certain areas. Don't self-plagiarize. If it's already published, make sure you cite yourself. Don't think about, oh, this is my piece of work, I can always copy and paste somewhere. It's really bad practice. Sometimes you might unintentionally do it, but if you have done it, make sure that you do correct those, and make sure you do have permissions. If you have acknowledged interviews, case studies, you do acknowledge those in your publications. So do seek agreements between authors, disclose any conflict of interest, and authors and editors needs to be supported by the committees on publication ethics. So that's absolutely fundamental when you're trying to publish in really internationally top refereed journals. So I think that is where we are coming to. And I think as an editor, like I said, as a deputy editor of the Journal of Enterprise Information Management, I think these are some of the things that we really look out for. Every journal is different, but what I've just highlighted to you is areas where these are common pitfalls we see as authors that we make, sometimes unintentional or intentionally, that needs to be avoided to make sure that you publish. Of course, as these are experiences that I share from sort of being a deputy editor as part of the Journal of Enterprise Information Management, where we look at sort of highly sort of significant intellectual contribution from relating to managers, how information is managed within sort of a business-driven enterprise. And that is important that we sort of, I thought it's important that I share sort of the things that we look at day in, day out, so that it helps you sort of make sure that you publish good pieces of work. So that very much brings me back to sort of a summary and a close down of sort of area of why do papers do get scientific papers do get rejected. There are a lot of reasons, but those are the fundamental sort of things that you need to you have some control over, that you really do go back and think about reflecting on how you can improve your piece of work to really be that published author that you seek in refereed journals within Emerald, be it sort of really highly reputable publishers. So I think that is it, and I'm sure I'm open to any questions. I haven't covered every single thing, but I hope it gives you sort of a rounded picture of where we are at this moment. Now, of course, we will take any questions, and I'm happy to answer anything that comes my way at the moment. Yep, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sankar. That was very informative and interesting. We have got some questions which have come through. The first question, how much does word count contribute to a rejection decision? If you are over the word count, is that an automatic rejection? Joe, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, happy to. I think the guidelines are there, so what we would ask is that you do take note of that. But I do think if an editor, and I'm sure Sankar will speak to this, if an editor sees that there is something really valuable in that piece of work, then we would work with the authors to see if there could be some attention paid to the paper to get it back within the word count. Some articles go over, some articles go under, but it's really about the quality, the originality of the research. And I think, you know, we are about accepting research and publishing research. We're not in the rejection business. Rejection is just part of a process of getting the research to be the best it potentially can be. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sankar?
Absolutely. I think, Joe, I think it's important. Most editors, reviewers look for sort of course, if you haven't, you are fundamentally looking at the guidelines and try and follow the guidelines, as we say. But it doesn't mean someone's going to stick to counting 10 words over and then you're rejected for that reason. They're not going to look at that. I think unless you produce if there's a clear instruction for 8,000 words and that's 20 odd pages, and then you produce a 50 odd pages or thesis, that's not something that's looking for. So you really need to get the balance right. But fundamentally, it's what the purpose of the work is. If it's the right fit for that journal, I think the originality and the clear aim needs to be really looked at, and the editors really would be looking at those fundamental questions rather than counting probably you have gone over 10 words, let me reject this person. That's not going to happen. So don't be too scared, but doesn't mean that you overlook the guidelines. I think what does really annoy editors and reviewers is if you are trying to not follow the guidelines of the journal and you don't show that you have taken an effort to format it in the way the journal really requires, and sort of those like I said, it's a good impression. Don't make those sloppy mistakes and have those sort of things. It's just really, your work doesn't deserve it. So if you have put in probably 1 year's worth of time, I think these are things that you really need to polish up before you submit.
Okay, thank you. The next question, what type of peer review do you think is best, and should that influence the choice of the journal to which the paper should be sent?
There's no right or wrong answer for that. Like I said, there's different peer reviews there for serving a purpose. All of them have their own purpose. And like I said, some work better depending on what type of journal and the editor's sort of requirement. Like I said, the common approach which is used within sort of is double blinded review process, where they're not, the author and the reviewers are not known. There's no bias. There's no sort of unconscious bias even in choosing sort of the work. So it's really independently looked at the quality of work that you produced, and there's no sort of any sort of judgment of this person's published in there. Your work as editor, and as an editor myself, need to be looked at what the piece of work is trying to contribute, the originality, I'll go back to it, the relevance, the impact that has, and how it's contributing to the society and the impact it creates to the economy or environment. I think that is fundamentally important. So I think sometimes the blinded reviews work really well, given sort of there's no any sort of bias approach. But like I said, there's the open review as well, where actually you choose the right experts in the field to make sure that the whole process is there to help sort of improve your work. And that is where I think sort of journals take different approaches, but there's no right or wrong answers. And every single peer review sort of approach works better at certain sort of junctures, I would say. Jo, anything else?
No, I would agree with you on that. It very much depends on a case-by-case basis, and probably the profile of the researcher as well, in terms of at what stage they are in their career. But it really needs to be part of a bigger decision, and the important thing I think is choosing a journal that has the right scope. And in order to do that, you know, as was mentioned earlier, please read the scope, really look at the different methodologies that the journal's interested in, and read some articles from that journal, get a feel for what it's about, and certainly on the journal homepages there are some of our Literati award-winning papers, and they're best practice. So what I would also say is have a look at those, because they can give you great guidance in terms of what a good paper looks like.
Okay, great. Another question, how soon after rejection can you resubmit? Do you need to disclose that there has been a previous rejection?
I can answer that, and Jo, you can just jump in as well. Good question. There is no sort of timeline, but I think it's a good practice if you are sort of looked at, like I said, if it's the wrong scope of journal that you're targeted unintentionally or intentionally, I don't know. You can probably look at the right scope and then go back and sort of look at the reviewer comments first. I would say really look at the reviewer comments if you have got a detailed reviewer comment or the editor's comments. If it was simply the fact that it wasn't the right scope, then you might choose to choose the right target journal and then submit the work. So there's no timeline as per se. You might do that very quickly. But if there's fundamental comments that has given to sort of say, actually your work needs improvement in terms of data, the methodological approach that or your purpose is not clear, then you will need to spend some time. Don't ignore that feedback, because that feedback, like I said, it's not personal, but it's there to improve your work. So do reflect on it. Just because you think I've got rejected here, I'll try my luck somewhere else. It's a small world, academia. So I would say make sure you use your time, reflect on the type of feedback that you have got. Sometimes it might apply to your work to improve it, and use that time wisely sort of to make that real improvements and then resubmit it. Now the second question in that was, do you need to disclose a rejection? No, absolutely not.
The second question was, how long after can you resubmit it?
I think I've answered that about the timeline. The other question was around if you need to disclose any rejections, which I haven't answered yet. I think that it doesn't really matter, because they're not worried about it, because you are fundamentally submitting a new piece of work to a new journal. So that's not there's no disclosure as per se. Correct, Joe?
Okay, this is another good question which lots of people have asked is, do you have any advice how to cope with bad feelings after rejection?
Very, very, very good question. I think sometimes, I scream about as well. Listen, I think anything, just even if it's journal publications or if you see some sort of negative sort of message, it does really have an impact on you. I would say make sure that you understand, like I said, leave it for a moment. It's human nature, right? So don't go back. If you do sort of think, leave it. I think you have put in the time and effort, so it's human nature to be a little bit sad, but go back to it probably after a day or two, reflect again on the why that has been rejected and the reviewers' comments on it, and think about taking every single point by point. Actually, does this really relate an improvement to your work? If it does, take some time to address that. Sometimes some of the things might not even be applicable, but that really depends on the type of comments you get. And you don't need to mean that you do then go and change fundamentally the piece of work thoroughly, because sometimes it might not be applicable into the work there where you're trying to publish. So really do sort of work with peers or colleagues, or think about any other editors in chief, run it past them, and you might see, and there will be, like I said, persevere. Don't leave. It's not the end of the world. There are different mediums, there are different journals that will let you sort of be publishable. But it's human nature. You are going to have that sort of initial reaction to it, but don't take it personal. You will get there eventually, and you will be able to publish. Joe, anything else?
No, I think I would agree with that. Obviously, you know, researchers are passionate about what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. And it, as you say, it's human nature. It would be very unusual for somebody not to be upset by a rejection. But as I said earlier, it's part of the process. And it's what we try to do is encourage as much constructive feedback that people can actually work on and use as a tool to improve their work. And as long as we can provide that, what we would say is try not to get too emotional about it, try and be practical, look at the guidance that's being given. As Sankar alluded to, use the expertise around you, perhaps go to different peers that might offer a different point of view, get a fresh pair of eyes on it, and take a deep breath, go back and try again, and you will get there eventually.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, so we might have to answer some of them by email, but one of which is coming in quite frequently is kind of an extension of what you were talking about. What to do when the editor rejects but offers absolutely no comment on why it has been rejected?
It's a tricky one. I think it's always good practice, as I think editors need to sort of understand, is to provide some feedback, but really depends on the volume of work that comes through to that. But it's important if there's no guidance being provided. I think that, well, it's thinking about whether if there is using sort of the peers or looking at sort of work that can be done of understand, because there's very rare, well, there will be sort of statements which say that it's not a fit for scope, or why has there been rejected. But if there's no guidance at all, it's not good practice usually. But I would suggest that in that case to think about different sort of journal angles that you can look at, or you can look at probably using your peers or colleagues, reviewers, to look at actually, did this fit this journal, or it might not be the scope that you are looked at for. So I think that's the key fundamental questions, rather than probably discarding the work that you have done and the effort that you have put out. So I think it's not good practice to not have any sort of signposting of why sort of, I think even if it's a simple statement about it's not fit for scope, I think that's what usually most, I guess, publishers would encourage, and that would be a certain sort of practice and recognition given. Anything else, Joe, would you say to that?
No, I would agree with you in terms of best practice would be to provide at least some sort of guidance as to why that is, and that's certainly something that we would encourage our editors to do, in order that the author can understand what would be the logical next step in the process. So I think in terms of if there isn't any, you can always come back and approach us to see if there is something that we can share with you. But again, as Sankar says, it's probably worth trying to get a fresh pair of eyes on your paper as well, and that might help identify some of the reasoning behind it.
Okay. We'll do 2 more questions and then we'll have to answer the rest by email, I think. But do you have any additional tips or suggestions for newcomer PhD students?
Good, very good. I think you're on the road, or your journey starts just there, I would say. I think you have spent your time following your research sort of passion through your PhD. I think the tips and tricks, I would say, really sort of user supervisors relationship that you have, making sure that if they are published experts, to sort of get the areas of expertise of choosing the right targets. I would say the target journal comes into a fundamental root. Try and sort of go through, before you publish in journals, conferences. I think that really does help sort of to sort of put your work out there in the public domain, get used to the review process. So start with sort of conferences, articles where you can try and publish and learn. Look at other good published papers within the journals. I think that's huge. I learned that way. You look at sort of how the, like I said, every journal probably has a different structure or requirement, writing style. Even generally, it might be the same sort of style, but they would have different preferences. So it's always good if you're choosing a target journal, for example, Journal of Enterprise Information Management, you would look at how the papers have been published in that area. Follow that, although your research might be very different, but look how it has been structured, how everything has been, the arguments, the logical flow of it. That makes a huge, let's say, guidance to as early career researchers and PhDs to follow sort of steps, and that will have a good impression even when you do submit it. It looks like a piece of work that really fits within, but use the expertise of your supervisors as well and other people who might have published in certain journal areas to sort of look at sort of publishing that perspective as an early career researchers. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Let me see. Here's one. Do editors, reviewers check who you are? Meaning whether you have the article already published, from which university you are, and what you've published in the past. Is that important in the publishing process?
Again, I'll go back to the good practices. Usually this is where the reviewers sort of attributes come in before even getting into that. Editors need to sort of have an impartial view. It needs to be focused on the research itself before they can make a judgment on your work based on, I guess, the credentials, the institution you are coming for. It needs to be as a best practice and a good practice as editors. Look at the work that you have put in place that has done. So it shouldn't be personal. It should be really aligned towards the work that you have produced and put forward as a scientific piece of contribution that you want to make. So I would really not, it's hard to say what the editors do behind, but I think the good practice there is really sort of to look at your work and not what the credentials that you come with, sort of where the institution which is there, it shouldn't be. And I think that's why even the peer review processes need to take a very blinded approach, an anonymous way, where there's no unconscious bias or any bias imposed on your piece of work that really deserves it. So that is how it should be approached. Jo?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying there, Sankar. I think the review process is based on that piece of work, and the credentials sort of, obviously there's experience in the paper and in the research, but in terms of sort of reviewing that specific piece of work and coming up with a sort of a judgment on that, then that should be based on what is in front of you and contained within the words on the page.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've run out of time now, so thank you very much to Sankar and Jo for attending and leading this webinar for us. We'll answer any other questions which we haven't answered so far by email, and lots of people have asked about getting the slides. You should be sent an email tomorrow which will have a recording of this presentation so you can review them as you like. And last thing, have a great summer. We'll be back in September with our next publishing webinar. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Safe and well,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.